Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I have here today a Finnish used Swedish M96 Mauser. Now, just last week, Henry and Josh over at 9-Hole Reviews did a video on the M96. They took one out to their 1,000-yard course and essentially clobbered it. It proved to be their best performing iron-sighted rifle on their course of fire to date. So if you're interested in how these fantastic rifles can shoot, check out their video, which I'll link at the end of this one. And if you're interested in the developmental history of the Swedish Mausers, well, Otthias and May over at Sea and Arsenal have a pair of excellent videos that go way deep into the development and the production and the, the use in World War I in particular of the Swedish Mausers. They actually have an episode on the rifles, the M96 like this, and also one on the M94 carbines that came first. And I'll link to one of those at the end of this video as well. So you may be wondering, where does that leave us? Why am I talking about one of these as well? And the answer is, I'd like to talk about the use of the M96 in Finland during the Winter War, because that is actually a pretty significant part of this rifle's history, especially its actual combat service history, where these rifles saw warfare in Finland, not so much actually in Sweden. So let's start in 1917, when the Finnish Civil War begins. There are already over 1,000 Swedish Mausers in Finland at that point. They'd been acquired privately by individual Finns, and they were used in the Civil War. These are, as you will see if you watch Henry's video, these are fantastic shooting rifles, and that quality was very much understood and appreciated by Finnish marksmen, competitive marksmen as well as Civil Guard members. And so the first recorded proper inventory numbers we have are in 1919, when the Civil Guard was really being set up, and it was given 1,390 officially given 1,390 Swedish M96 rifles, which accounted for most of what was in Finland at that time. By 1924, we know that there were about 2,000 of them in Finland, about 2/3 of those being in private hands and another third in Civil Guard inventory. Now, what happened in the early 1920s, the Finnish Civil Guard had an assortment of different weapons. They had some Swedish Mausers, they obviously had a lot of Mosin Nagants, and they also had a lot of Arisakas that had come through Russian ownership and ended up in Finnish possession. And in the early 1920s, the Civil Guard used all of these different things. In fact, what's interesting about the M96s is they were really good target rifles, as I've already said a couple of times. So good, in fact, that guardsmen in official shooting competitions were actually given handicap bonuses if they were using Arisakas or Mosin Nagants. Now, that's not so much necessarily because, especially by the late 20s, because the Mosins in Finnish service weren't very good. Part of this was the poor availability of good quality ammunition in 7.62x54 in the early 20s in Finland. But the M96 was such a good rifle that if they didn't artificially compensate the scores of people shooting other rifles that were in fact more common in Finland, they were worried that, well, everyone's going to switch to shooting Swedish Mausers, and then, then we're going to have some trouble because that's not actually our issue rifle. We don't have a lot of them. We want people to actually train with their service weapons. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit off topic here. By the late 1920s, the Civil Guard had standardized on Mosin Nagants, and so the Swedish Mauser wasn't really a major element in Finnish military planning until we hit 1939, 1940, when the Winter War breaks out. And at that point, Finland is not very well prepared. Field Marshal Mannerheim is really quite vocal to the Finnish government that they are not ready for a war with Russia, that this will be a major problem. They don't have enough armament, they don't have enough training, things are out of maintenance. And one of the responses is that with the outbreak of the war, the Finns purchase a whole lot of Swedish Mausers from Sweden. Now, in 1925, Sweden had sort of unilaterally reduced the size of its military pretty significantly. And so Sweden actually had a lot of these rifles available that they didn't need. In fact, if you look at the data, you'll see that production of these rifles kind of ends in 1925. They had more than they needed. And so they were happy to sell Finland, ultimately, what would be 77,000 of them. To put this in context, that's approaching, it's not quite, but that's getting close to the total number of Finnish M39 Mosins that were ever produced. There were a lot of these things that came into Finland in the first couple months, essentially during the Winter War, January, February, and March of 1940. So many, in fact, and like in such a rush that when the Winter War ended, there were still something like 15,000 Swedish Mausers that were in their original packing material. The Finns hadn't even gotten a chance to unpack them. They also hadn't paid for that last batch yet. Let me follow up on that in a moment. And first say, these also did see service in Finland. If you look at the data, you will see that these rifles typically, they were assigned to things like anti-aircraft units and naval units and coastal artillery units and coastal infantry units. And that kind of makes one think that these are second line rifles. And yes, to a large extent, the idea was the guys who are in the heaviest fighting, the guys who are in the Karelian Isthmus, give them standardized Mosin Nagants, simplify the ammunition, that sort of thing, and give the Swedish Mausers to people in other areas where you're not going to have those logistical issues. Well, those other areas did include a couple of places that saw a lot of service. So a lot of these went up into the northern areas of Finland. There were about 8,000 men of the Swedish Volunteer Corps who came to Finland to join in the fighting in the Winter War. Sweden was officially neutral, but the vast majority of the Swedish population supported the Finnish cause in the Winter War. There was fundraising. In fact, the rifles that were brought by the Swedish Volunteer Corps were all paid for by volunteer fundraising in Sweden. And the Swedish Army was willing to grant leave to Swedish Army officers and men to go fight in Finland as long as their jobs weren't judged essentially crucial in Sweden. So the Swedish government tacitly approved of these volunteers coming to Finland. They just weren't willing to take on Russia by officially taking a side in the war. At any rate, these 8,000 volunteers left all their guns behind when they came back at the end of the Winter War. And so that was another 8,000 Swedish Mausers that came into Finland, including, by the way, close to 1,000 carbines. The Finns never purchased any of the M94 or 94-14 carbines, but the volunteers did bring some, and there were some that were privately acquired in Finland. And by the end of World War II, the Finns had about 900 carbines as well. Anyway, in addition to being used up in the northern areas, that's where the Swedish volunteers were mostly deployed. And that's an area where resupply was difficult anyway, so send them all the ammunition that we get from the Swedes, send them Swedish Mausers, they'll work out nicely up there. And then coastal infantry, like the Finnish Navy doesn't actually have a lot of boats. It actually also has a lot of infantry units, and the coastal artillery and the coastal infantry units saw a lot of fighting during the Winter War, especially at the end, towards the end of the Winter War. And so those guys armed with Swedish Mausers did in fact see quite a lot of combat. Now, this all comes to an end after 105 days, and like I said, the Finns never even got a chance to unpack the last batch of Swedish Mausers that they had gotten. And at this point, like, no sooner had the Winter War ended, really, than Germany goes in and starts sending troops into Denmark and Norway, and Sweden gets rather nervous about this and kind of asks, can we get, like, some of those rifles back? That whole we downsized our military in 1925 thing, like, maybe we're going to rethink that now. And so about a third of Finland's Swedish Mausers went back to Sweden in the spring, the summer, maybe the fall of 1940, about 30,000 rifles in total, including 6,000 of the guns that the Volunteer Corps had brought, 15,000 that had been packed up and never actually unwrapped or been paid for. Well, we don't have to pay for them, we'll just send them back. And then about 10,000 additional guns taken back out of Finnish inventory. So let's take a closer look at this. There's one particular specific marking that identifies this as a Finnish used gun, and then we'll talk about what continued to happen to these after the Winter War and the Continuation War. All right, so here's our basic receiver marking. This is one of the rifles that was made at Carl Gustafstad, the Swedish ordnance factory. This one dates from 1925, which makes it one of the later production M96 rifles. It's after 1925 that production basically is tabled for 15 years. And then what we see here that identifies this as Finnish is this SA in a box. And that SA stands for Finnish Army. Finland in Finnish is Suomi. So this is Finnish Army, a Finnish Army property stamp. And what's interesting is these were added in, Finland started using this stamp in 1941. So about 2/3 of the rifles, basically the rifles that Finland kept in its possession after 1941 would have gotten this stamp. And this indicates that this was in Finnish service or in Finnish property during the Continuation War. Well as being in service or in property during the Winter War as well. We have a couple other numbers here. We have a serial number. BH are the initials of the Swedish armorer inspection officer who approved this rifle into Finnish service or into Swedish service when it was first produced. So different Swedish Mausers, you will find different initials here because the officer in charge of the inspections changed every few years. BH is appropriate for 1925. Mechanically speaking, this is an 1896 pattern of Mauser. It is a cock-on-close Mauser action. So holds 5 rounds of Swedish 6.5 by 55 millimeter ammunition. This was initially a 160 grain round nose projectile, and that was actually used all the way up until 1940. So it's that cartridge that the Finns would have been using in the Winter War, the old style of round nose flat-based bullet. At that time, these rifles had stock discs in them that were attached with 2 screws and had an abbreviation for the unit that the rifle was issued to. In 1941, Sweden would adopt a new ammunition, a new cartridge, essentially, for a new bullet design for their same 6.5 by 55 millimeter cartridge. This was the M41 cartridge, and it was a Spitzer, a pointed bullet with a boat tail base. 139 grains, higher velocity, a much more modern cartridge, and it is after that happened that this new style of stock disc was included. And there are lots of details on the internet you can find about decoding this. This essentially tells you the bore condition and the potential holdover necessary for that M41 ammunition. And so this indicates that this rifle was in Swedish hands at some point after 1941. So we'll get to that in a moment, but for the moment, for the time being, let me just say that this is normal and appropriate to find on a Finnish used Swedish Mauser. One of the things that makes these such good shooters are the new sights that were introduced in 1941 with the new ammunition. This is a nice square-topped flat front sight post with a matching rear tangent sight that has a U-notch rear sight. They got rid of the old barleycorn style sights and went to this much more effective pattern instead. So these rifles would see continued use in Finnish service in the Continuation War. Although Finland was better equipped with, say, a lot of M39s by that point, but these still saw service. By the end of the Continuation War, the Finns had about 50,000 of these rifles still in inventory, along with their 900 or so carbines. But after World War II ends, they're in less of a position to need non-standardized rifles. And so all of these would end up being surplused by Finland between 1951 and 1953. Now, what makes this even more interesting to me is when the Finns sell these rifles off as surplus, Sweden buys up most of them, or almost all of them. And they go back to Sweden, and they go back into military service. And that is why they have the Finnish marked ones will often, usually, be found with these Swedish stock discs for M41 ammunition. It's because Sweden had not adopted 7.62 NATO in the 1950s. They wouldn't adopt the G3 rifle for actually a little while still to come after that. And being able to, they had a lot of 6.5 ammunition, and being able to put these rifles back into service made sense for them at that time. So these are rifles that were originally made in Sweden, first few made in Germany, the majority of them, including this particular one, made in Sweden, served in the Swedish military, then sent over to Finland, served in the Finnish military in actual combat, and then came back to Sweden, went back into the Swedish military before ultimately being surplused and coming, many of them at least, like this one, then coming into the United States with a mixture of both Swedish and Finnish identifying marks and provenance. So that's, I think, a very interesting history to a particular class of rifles. These are guns that, like, don't underestimate how much combat service these did actually see in the Winter War. And the total of 77,000, ultimately more like 85,000 if you count the volunteers rifles, like close to 10% of Swedish M96 production actually was in Finland at one time or another. And a significant proportion of that saw combat service. So I think that makes these really quite interesting rifles. Now, like I said at the beginning, if you would like more information on the original development of the Swedish Mausers, check out Othais and May's video. If you want to see just how well these things can shoot on a 1,000-yard course with open iron sights, check out Henry and Josh's video. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching.